So we're now in week 4 of our Connect series, this time where we've been wanting to connect with one another and gather over the last 4 weeks in small groups. And we've also been looking at the question, what matters most? And so for the last 3 weeks, the answer to that question has been to be all in and to be happy and to be wise. This week, well, I'm not going to give it to you at the start because it's not so obvious or easy in today's parable. We're going to have to see. So I want to start though with a warning that could be applied to the parable of the 10 bridesmaids last week, and it could be applied to the parable of the sheep and goats next week, and to today's parable. And that's to be careful of a superficial reading of the parables generally, because the very point of Jesus' parables was that they're meant to exercise our minds and to stretch us. If we jump to an easy answer as to the parable's meaning, there's a good chance that we've actually got it wrong. There's something surprising and even mind-bending about the parables, which we don't always see straight away because we live in a very different place and time than the world which Jesus drew upon in order to tell his stories. It's also tough, I think, for us for another reason, and that is that we live in an age which likes things at sort of soundbite kind of level. Neatly packaged and easy to digest. But we don't get such a neatly packaged interpretation when it comes to the scriptures. So the way that the parable we have just heard in today's gospel is often spoken about is that there's a very straightforward kind of moral to the story. To use the gifts or talents that you've been given by God, and more will be given to you. Which, now I'm not suggesting that's entirely wrong, but there's a few problems with reducing our parable to this. The first issue here is the response of the master. He seems to be saying that to everyone who uses their talents, even more talents will be given. Now, this seems to fly in the face of the usual way that we think about our God-given abilities. I think most of us think we've got a finite amount of gifts and talents, that we're naturally good at some things and we're bad at other things. And we can't just go out and use the gifts we've got in order to make more talents. Interestingly though, thanks to a better understanding of our brains that's really only come about in the last 20 years or so, we now know that we're not actually given a finite amount of talent at our birth, but we are able to grow and develop our talents precisely by using the talents that we've got. The brain science shows us that when we use our gifts, we do actually grow in our capacity. And we actually do make more talents with the ones that we've got. So does contemporary brain research then confirm Jesus' ancient wisdom here to use your talents, otherwise you'll lose them? The problem with this conclusion is that when we hear the word talent, we immediately think of the natural gifts or abilities that God's given us. But that's not what a talent was in the first century. In Jesus' time, a talent was a unit of measurement. So the value of 5 or 2 or 1 talent isn't clear because we don't know if it was 5, 2 or 1 talent of gold or silver or copper or tin. We do know that a talent was a big enough measure that no matter whether it was gold, silver or copper being measured, it was a large amount that we're talking about. Now we actually get the English word talent and its meaning from this parable, because the master gave each servant a number of talents that was based upon each servant's ability. So our understanding of talent as a natural gift or ability isn't what Jesus' original audience would have understood by the term, because it didn't have that meaning as yet. The fact that the word talent was a unit of measurement of material wealth doesn't mean that the purpose of the parable is actually to tell us and go off and become venture capitalists who invest in the markets to make more money. That interpretation has been used to try and justify pursuing material prosperity, but it just simply doesn't sit with everything else that Jesus tells us about the right use of money in the Gospels. And remember, a parable is a story about one thing to make a point about something else. So I think the key to understanding the parable today actually comes from the master's words to those 2 servants who used their talents to make 5 and 2 more, respectively. The master says to them both, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You can be faithful in small things. I'm going to trust you now with greater. come and share in your master's joy or happiness. So here's the twist in the parable as I see it, that even though 5 or 2 talents would have been the equivalent to a large sum of money, the master considers this to be a small thing. But now they're to be entrusted with greater responsibility as a consequence. So I think the point of the parable could be summed up as this: if we're faithful, then we will be fruitful. Or to put it another way, in the light of our Connect series, what matters most is that we're faithful in small things. If we are, then God will trust us with greater. So what does faithfulness to God in small things look like? Well, 2020 has meant that some people around the world have had to be faithful in huge, even really large, even huge things. I'm thinking about the heroism of medical professionals in caring for the sick and dying, even to the point of contracting COVID themselves. And I'm thinking of our leaders who've had to make incredibly difficult decisions affecting the welfare of whole nations, and especially the most vulnerable members of those nations. I'm not saying that all leaders have done this perfectly well worldwide, or even very well at all, or that all of them have done this with faithfulness to God as the main motivation for their actions. But there's no doubt that in these circumstances, a heroic response has been required. For most of us here, though, in Penshurst and around Australia, 2020 has required us to be faithful in what might seem like small things, ordinary things. This is partly because for a good chunk of 2020, our world has contracted to our own families and houses during lockdown, and it's only slowly and gradually opening up further. It had to be about seemingly small things during this time because our scope for big things was severely curtailed. But this seems to be precisely the parable's point. Faithfulness in small, ordinary things might actually end up being really big, in God's eyes at any rate. Examples of this in 2020 might include recovering a sense of family time by having meals together rather than eating while we're on our individual devices. Persevering in looking for work and not losing hope after losing your job. Apologising and forgiving each other when the pressure of living on top of one another has proved too intense. Kids loving your parents when they were trying to teach you at home, and parents loving your kids when you were trying to teach them at home. Reaching out to the parishioner or neighbour who lives alone, or continuing to say one's prayers when you had big questions about what on earth God seemed to be doing in the world in general, or with you in particular. So then, if the point of the parable is that Jesus wants us to be faithful in little things, which of the servants do you most identify with? Are you like the third servant, the one who buries his talent given to him? Notice that this servant accuses the master of being demanding and as someone to be feared. Now, Jesus' point here might be not that the master actually agrees with this when he says, this is what you think. He's actually challenging the servant perhaps to think, you've got a distorted image of what I'm like. Jesus' point might be here to actually say that it's possible for us to have a similarly distorted image of God. That if our image of God is like the third servant's image of the master, then our fear and distorted image of God might lead us to bury our talents, rather than to use our gifts for the benefit of others. In so doing, we run the risk of not sharing in God's happiness and joy because we don't see God as anything other than an exact and harsh and demanding taskmaster. Or are you like the second servant? The second servant might even be the hero of the story because he doesn't waste any time comparing himself to the first servant, who's been given more talents than he has. It could be like the servants given 5 talents are like the superstars of the Christian life. They're the saints, the supremely gifted, the really holy perhaps. The second servant knows he's not like the superstars, but he does the best with what he's got. He makes the most of what he's been given. But notice that the master doesn't distinguish between those given 5 and those given 2. He says the same thing to both of them. Well done, good and faithful servant. The point here, I think, is that it's pointless to compare ourselves with others but simply to be faithful to God with the small things that we've been given. But also notice that the first and the second servant have a really different image of God to the third servant. They don't see him as harsh or demanding, and so they're not afraid of him. They see him as generous, and they feel safe enough to take risks and to use the master's talents creatively to make more talents. They realise that God has given them gifts, and they return those gifts out of love. They don't bury them out of fear. In so doing, they're fruitful, and they're entrusted with more from a generous God, and so are able to enter into the master's happiness and joy. So, are you like the first, the second, or the third servant? If you're the third servant, what do you need to do to change the image of God that you have so that you're no longer scared of him? If you're like the second or the first servant, having been faithful in small things, how might the Lord be entrusting you with greater things? What new thing is he asking you to do? So we've asked the same question 4 times now. What matters most? Today, it's to be faithful. To be faithful in the little things so as to enter into the joy of the Lord.